A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order, and I'd now like to recognize myself for an opening statement. Before I do, I will mention that votes will be called during this hearing, and we will adjourn. Let's see how far we get, and then we will adjourn and possibly come back, and if we get far enough, we may just adjourn the hearing altogether, but we'll just see how far we get. Also, when I ask unanimous consent for Tom Rooney from Florida to sit on the dais when he gets here and offer a statement. Without objection, so ordered. As a businessman who was involved in the real estate industry, I have a keen level of interest in today's subcommittee hearing to examine the issues of property rights in Cuba and U.S. and Cuban property claims against the Castro regime. I believe that in the Obama administration's zeal to engage the Castro regime at any cost, we have lost sight of a critical issue that has not received the priority that it deserves. Thousands of Americans and Cuban citizens suffered humiliation and financial distresses of having their private property stolen from them, some of them at gunpoint. Today, there has been no justice for their claims. Lest we forget, I think it's important for the American people to remember what led in part to the U.S. embargo against Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro brutally seized power and quickly nationalized the American-dominated sugar and mining industries. He froze bank accounts and confiscated property from thousands of both Cuban and American citizens and businesses in what the Inter-American Law Review called the largest uncompensated taking of American property by a foreign government in history. This stealing of American private property in part led the U.S. severing diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1961 and enacting a trade embargo and sanctions. In 1964, President John F. Kennedy signed a bill into law authorizing the U.S. Foreign Claims Settlement Commission to begin a Cuba program to address the claims of U.S. citizens against the Castro regime. Since that time, the Commission has adjudicated almost 8,900 U.S. claims, finding almost 6,000 of those claims to be certified. When we look at the financial value of these claims today, the total cost comes to over $6 billion. Now the Obama administration's re-engagement with the communist Castro regime, restoration of diplomatic ties, and pursuit of normalized relations have been performed ostensibly to empower the Cuban people. However, I have not seen any evidence of things getting better for the Cuban people. In fact, since December's announcement, we've seen almost a 120% increase in the number of Cubans fleeing to the United States. Over 3,000 political arrests by the Castro regime, spikes in violence against democracy activists, and rearrest of most of the 53 political prisoners who were released as part of the December agreement. The American people who decided to travel to Cuba under the relaxed Obama administration rules should at least be aware that their decision to spend money on Cuban hotels, tourism, rum, or cigars directly props up the communist military, intelligence services, and human rights abusers in the Castro regime. Americans should know that the hotel they vacation in may very well be a property that was stolen from an American citizen. As I stated at our last subcommittee hearing on Cuba back in February, I strongly oppose the Obama administration's decision to normalize relations with the oppressive communist Cuba Castro regime. U.S. law requires a change to the very nature of the regime through the establishment of democracy and allowance of freedom. U.S. law also requires the resolution of property claims issue. In 1996, Congress expressed its intent in the Libertad Act, stating that the satisfactory resolution of property claims by the Cuban government recognized by the United States remains an essential condition for the full resumption of economic and diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. That Libertad Act is not being followed by the Obama administration. If we are truly going to re-engage with the communist Castro regime, then I believe it's critical that we not only follow U.S. law, but that for the purposes of upholding the rule of law worldwide, we negotiate only from a position of strength on the issue of property claims. Should we fail to do that, I fear that we would be setting a terrible example and signaling to other bad actors around the world that they will face no consequences for stealing American property. This would be a terribly harmful message to send. Last year, I had the privilege to travel with the full committee chairman, Ed Royce, and ranking member Engel on a bipartisan delegation to South America, where we visited some of our best partners in the Hemisphere, including Colombia and Peru. During our visit to Peru, I was personally delighted to sit with award-winning Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto one evening over dinner. Hernando is known best for his work on the informal economy and on the importance of business and property rights. The main message of de Soto's work and writings is that no nation can have a strong market economy without adequate participation in an information framework that records ownership of property and other formal economic activity. It is in this spirit that I wanted to convene this hearing today, because in Cuba, most of what passes for economic activity is simply informal opportunities for the Castro brothers and the Cuban military to siphon off money to prop themselves up, spy on their people, deny basic human rights, and beat and torture people who disagree with them. So in conclusion, the future of property rights in Cuba and the issue of U.S. claims against the communist Castro regime should not be forgotten in any U.S.-Cuba re-engagement. These issues impact not only U.S. business claimants with the highest amounts of certified loss, such as Cuba Electric Company, North American Sugar Industries, or MOA Bay Mining Company. These issues also have devastated individuals and families for generations. Today, I hope that experiences that the witnesses will share will inform our actions, offer constructive ideas on what responsible and just outcome on this issue would involve, and motivate the Obama administration to prioritize the needs of the American people above a legacy achievement with the communist Castro regime. This hearing could not come at a more important time, as recent press reports have indicated that the Obama administration has already made key concessions on limiting American diplomats' activities in a possible future embassy in Havana, which follows its removal of Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list last month, even though Cuba continues to harbor terrorists and proliferate weapons to bad actors around the world. With that, I look forward to hearing from our two panels of witnesses today, and I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Albio-Ceres, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and I certainly concur with a lot of the comments that you made. We're here to bring attention to how the Castro brothers have confiscated thousands of properties from U.S. companies and Cuban citizens in the early years of the revolution. Before the expropriations began, over two-thirds of the Cuban economy was owned by private entities, many of whom were Americans. The Castro brothers started taking ranches and farms just months after Castro came to power, and quickly moved to U.S.-owned oil refineries and other properties. Castro seized everything in sight, including 2 million acres of land, electric companies, the mining industry, warehouses, hotels, private properties, and bank accounts. Additionally, they seized almost all assets of Cuban nationals between 1959 and 1968. The Foreign Claims Settlement Commission has certified over 5,000 claims, and when combined with interest, total almost $8 billion. As the administration continues to normalize relationship with Cuba, we must take time to re-examine these claims and see how we can get justice for these claimants before further inroads are made between Cuba and the U.S. Many of the confiscated properties have been sold and resold. Their owners deceased, and now their families are left fighting on their behalf. Most families were never able to recover, either financially or mentally, being forced to give up their homes, ancestral belongings, and millions of dollars worth of investments cannot go unanswered. How can U.S. businesses open up economic cooperation with a government who profited on the back of other people's hard work? Not only is it immoral to profit off these stolen properties, but Cuba's past disregard for property rights created an unstable investment climate for private businesses. There is no way to ensure that the Cuban regime won't swoop in and confiscate more properties or renegade on its so-called contracts. We must examine how a shift in relationship with Cuba will impact these long outstanding claims. The issue of confiscated properties by the Cuban regime has always been a major hurdle in normalizing relationship with Cuba. Just because the administration has shifted strategy, it doesn't mean we should detract from our effort to find an equitable and long overdue solution for the victims. Today, we will be able to hear from experts from the Foreign Settlements Commission that have gone through the efforts of certifying these claims, as well as victims whose families have lost their homes and businesses to the Castro regime's greed. I look forward to hearing from our panelists on how we can address these critical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. By unanimous consent, we allowed Representative Rooney from Florida to sit on the dais. I now recognize Mr. Rooney for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I'll just say that I appreciate you having this hearing. To the panel members that are here, you know, what brought this about for me was as a member of the Florida delegation, going to law school at the University of Miami and getting to meet some of the constituents or some of the citizens that live down there, and coming to recognize that, as naive as I was at that point, that a lot of the people that I met were actually people that lived in Cuba that left, that the ranking member was speaking of, thinking that at someday soon after they left Cuba, that they'd lock their doors and that they'd be back relatively in short order. And it just dawned on me that talking to these people who are a little bit older now, that they really believe something, that if that would happen to an American citizen, something so fundamental that you own this property or you own this business, and for whatever reason you had to leave, and you turned around and locked the door behind you thinking that I'll be back in a couple days or a week or at the most, you know, a month, but that which I built, that which I own, something so dear to us as Americans, as our property rights, would be mine again. And to have that decades go by and to not be able to return to that which is rightfully yours. For us to say that we're going to ease restrictions in Cuba and not follow the law, as Mr. Duncan referred to, the 96 Libertad law, I think would be unconscionable, and something so unfair as we know it as Americans, is to deprive people of their rightful property. And a lot of people, even people on my side of the aisle, sometimes say, what's the difference between Cuba and China and other communist countries that we do business with? I mean, after all, it's been a long time. Let's just forget about it and move on. The difference is that I have constituents, people that are alive and well, that owned property in Cuba, that left, that live in the state of Florida, that believe that our government will take care of them, that are citizens now, but when they ease restrictions with Cuba, that when we do that as a government, we are going to follow U.S. law, and we are going to demand that this president first recognize, by forcing the Castro regime to recognize the property rights of those people that are still alive today, still living in Florida, that are constituents, and that it's our responsibility as their elected officials to make sure we follow the law. So when people ask you, what is the difference between China and other communist countries that we do business with in Cuba, the difference is that there are constituents, and we owe it to them to enforce the law, to follow the law, and to live the American spirit, which is property rights, that goes back to our very founding. And if we don't do that, then we are, I think, neglecting the very fabric of what this country is. So I really appreciate, as this administration decides to move forward in easing restrictions, if they're going to do that, the very first step in making what past wrongs there were right would be to make sure that our constituents in the state of Florida and across this country are made whole again by that which was taken from them, their property in Cuba. So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for letting me sit in today. I appreciate you hearing this bill.
I want to thank the gentleman from Florida for his comments, and remind the other members that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Before I recognize the panel, let me just explain the lighting system. You've got 5 minutes. The light will be green until it gets to 1 minute. It'll turn yellow, and then when you're out of time, it'll be red. At that point in time, if you could just wrap up your final statement. And you've submitted your testimony for us and beforehand, which we've had an opportunity to read. And so if you don't get through the complete statement, we have it. We've read it. We're understanding. But we want to get you on the record verbally. So I'll now recognize our panelists. And our first panelist is Mr. If I pronounce this wrong, Tamargo? Tamargo. Mr. Tamargo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Sierras, and members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to appear before this great committee where I used to work. It has been a long time since these certified claims have been given this much public attention. I commend the subcommittee for convening this hearing, and I hope the subcommittee continues to play an active role in the long overdue settlement of these claims. I will summarize my remarks and ask that the full text of my testimony be placed in the record. I also request, if possible, that the record be held open for those certified claimants who were not able to testify so they can submit a statement for the record. Over 55 years ago, the revolutionary government of Cuba confiscated the real and personal property of thousands of Americans and others who were living and doing business in Cuba. To this day, that chapter in U.S. history represents the largest confiscation of American property, and there has been no progress in settling these certified claims. I'm encouraged but guarded by the possibility of serious negotiations between the United States and Cuba regarding the certified American claims. We have heard different numbers as to how many certified claims there are. There are, in fact, 5,913 certified claims. When certified, they were valued at $1.8 billion. Today, they are valued at around $7 to $8 billion due to the 6% simple interest called for under international law and certified by the Commission. No American claims program has been left pending and unpaid for this long. I do not count the Soviet program because, although it's still pending and unsettled, it was partially settled. Many ideas and proposals are floating around as to how to settle these claims. Some have asked me about the property problem between the U.S. and Cuba. My answer to that is that there is no property problem because, unfortunately, there is no property. Under international law, the American property is gone. The Cuban government confiscated it, but the U.S. has a right to fair compensation for its citizens. Not only do I believe the U.S. should settle for nothing less than the full price of the claims plus 100% of the interest, but I call on the administration and the Congress to hold fast and not remove any key element further from the embargo that remains unless the claimants receive full and fair payment for their certified claims. As requested, I have a few legislative recommendations. First and foremost, these claims are the reason the embargo was created. Congress must not pass any legislation further easing the embargo unless these certified claims are paid and settled. We only get one shot at this. We have only one thing Cuba wants. It is access to the U.S. market through lifting the embargo. If the Congress gives that away without getting these claims paid, then the Congress will have failed to stand up for these American families and companies. Second, I urge the Congress to enact legislation to grant limited authority to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission to update the certified claims as to who is the current certified claimant. As I have already explained, claims programs are not designed to go unpaid for 55 years. Multiple generations of claimants have come and gone, and it will take years to ascertain who are the certified claimants right now. Also, do the same for the Soviet certified claims. Not only is this good governmental housekeeping, but it costs us nothing, and it sends a strong message to Cuba. Thirdly, I am hopeful that the certified claims will be paid in these negotiations, but you never know. We have been waiting 55 years, and we may get the same status quo. We know the current American trade and travel business with Cuba is trespassing on stolen American property. We know this because a runway expansion at Jose Marti Airport is on land, which is the subject of a certified claim, and also probably true of other Cuban airports, and the port of Mariel and other Cuban ports, and probably most of the infrastructure. Also, they all use land, which is the subject of American certified claims. Congress needs to enact a trespass penalty of 10% on all trade, travel, commerce, remittances, toll calls, gifts, flyover fees, port duty, everything. The proceeds collected by the trespass penalty would go to a fund which would pay all the certified claimants for their full amount, including interest. The trespass penalty would not release Cuba of its debt, but now the debt will be owed to the U.S. government. Those doing travel and trade with Cuba should just consider the trespass penalty as the cost of using someone's property. The current ongoing, never-ending waiting is ridiculous and intolerable to the certified claimants. It is the U.S. Congress' responsibility to end this embarrassing 55-year wait by our fellow Americans. Fourth, The final recommendation is not to Congress, it is to all those American families and companies who are holding certified claims against Cuba. I urge you to get engaged in this discussion and to write your congressmen, your senators, the President, the State Department, and keep writing and calling them. American certified claimants need to demand that their claims be settled. And if they're not going to be settled, then they should be paid this trespass penalty. It is wrong to continue to hold these certified claimants hostage to this never-ending battle over Cuba policy. It is not fair to these American families and companies who did nothing wrong except have the courage to invest in Cuba. Thank you.
I'll thank the gentleman. In my haste, I failed to mention the biographies of the witnesses and panelists are in our binders, and you've had the opportunity to read those. Mr. Bradley, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me. You have my bio, so you know I retired from federal service in 2008 after 20 years as chief counsel of the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. I'm pleased to be invited here today to say some words about the Commission's Cuba Claims Adjudication Program. As we know, following the overthrow of the Batista regime in Cuba and Fidel Castro's takeover on January 1, 1959, the Castro regime began a comprehensive drive to seize business enterprises, assets, and other private property on the island. Given the extensive American involvement in Cuba's economy at the time, American companies and individuals were particularly affected by these actions. Some of the takings were overt, such as the outright nationalization of certain industries under Law 1076 of December 5, 1962, and the expropriations under Law 851 of July 6, 1960, which were directed toward Cuban concerns in which Americans held majority interests. In addition, all properties of persons who had left Cuba were confiscated under Law 989 of December 6, 1961. Other takings were more subtle, such as administrative requirements placed on mining and oil concession holders to re-register their concessions under circumstances that made compliance impossible. One of the first U.S. responses to these actions was an effort by Senator Burke Hickenlooper to amend the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 to impose a trade embargo on Cuba and prohibit the furnishing of foreign assistance to the, quote, present government of Cuba. However, the amendment was not enacted, and the Department of Treasury did not move to freeze Cuban assets in the United States until July 1963. Consequently, most of those assets, possibly as much as $500 million, had already been transferred out of the country, primarily to Canada, by the time the blocking took place. In October '64, Congress passed, as you mentioned, House of Representatives Bill H.R. 12259, which became Public Law 88666 and is codified as Title V of the International Claims Settlement Act of 1949, as amended. The statute authorized and directed the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission to determine the validity and amount of U.S. nationals' claims against Cuba for expropriation and other taking of property and other assets affected on or after January 1959, and certify its findings of the amounts of the losses sustained to the Secretary of State. In addition, the Commission was authorized and directed to determine the validity and amount of claims against Cuba for disability or death of U.S. citizens, resulting from actions taken by or under the authority of the Cuban government. The purpose of the adjudication process was to compile a record of the claims which could eventually serve as the basis for a lump sum settlement agreement with a future Cuban government. The period for filing claims officially commenced November 1, 1965, and was to end on May 1, 1967. By law, the program was to be completed as of May 1, 1970. However, due to budget cuts for fiscal year 1969, the program could not be completed by the statutory time, and further legislation was finally obtained which extended it to July 6, 1972. As has been mentioned, a total of 8,816 claims were evaluated in the course of the program. Of these, 5,911 were certified as valid with a total value of over $1.8 billion, not including interest. Adding the interest component, the claims come to over $7.6 billion in worth. I should also mention that two additional claims were certified by the Commission in 2006 in a small second program we conducted at the request of the Secretary of State. Of the claims, over $1.6 billion was certified in the names of 898 American corporations, with 5,013 totaling 221 million certified in the names of individuals. We had 131 certifications in excess of 1 million, and the largest certification in favor of the Cuban Electric Company amounted to over 267.5 million in principal amount. This concludes my statement, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
I want to thank the panelists and for excellent opening statements. I want to align myself with the comments by Representative Rooney. One of the fundamental principles of a free society and a free economy is private property ownership, and the understanding that if you invest money in real estate, develop a home or a business property, or even develop a business in general, that you own that property and you have some sort of free assurances that it won't be confiscated by a government, whether it's this government or a government abroad, and if you're an American investor. And so the claims are clear that Americans and Cuban Americans have. The Foreign Claims Settlement Commission has adjudicated a lot of these, as we've heard. So now we see the Obama administration acting in defiance of the 1996 Libertad Act, and really in defiance, I think, of what the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission has proven through its adjudication. And so what is the role of the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission if we're just going to ignore its findings, if we're not going to apply those findings to future negotiations and normalization of trade? So the question I have to you is, what role do you expect the FCSC to play in relation to the State Department's prioritization of the resolution of almost 6,000 certified claims? What role is the FCSC playing now with the administration? Mr. Tamaga.
Traditionally, when those negotiations begin in other situations, in previous settlement discussions, the Commission plays a technical supporting role. The lead negotiating, all the negotiating is done by the State Department.
But it sounds to me like the State Department's ignoring.
Well, they have put out some public statements to the effect of that this is on their list of things to discuss with the Cubans government, and but they have not, as of yet, as far as the public is aware, public record is aware, began those discussions yet.
Right. So there's been 2 Cuba programs with FCSC.
That's correct.
Almost 9,000 claims have been brought before those 2 programs. Should there be a third?
It would depend on, traditionally, under international law, each country adjudicates the claims of its own citizens, and under international law, it was citizenship at the time of the taking. That is under international law. It's the U.S. Congress is not bound by it, and they could choose to interpret or create a program that would go beyond international law and adjudicate claims for claims of individuals that were not American citizens at the time. But one must be aware that there are millions of those.
Right.
That would encompass
Millions of those that were Cubans at the time the property was seized that are now Cuban Americans because they've immigrated here.
Yes.
But
yes.
the way I see it, they still have claims on property back in Cuba that was seized by the government when businesses were nationalized. Go ahead, sir.
Traditionally, this issue of property under property ownership interruption by communist governments have happened throughout history, and every country has had to create some sort of reconciliation commission. This problem ultimately will have to be dealt with by the Cuban government. Which
doesn't seem willing at this point in time to make any concessions. They're just saying, okay, we'll open up our relations, but we're not going to change our principles of economic freedom or the lack thereof. We're not going to give the Cuban people more freedom of speech, more freedom to peacefully assemble, more freedom to worship, more freedom to the internet and access to free press, no information sharing. They're being kept in the dark. They had their property seized, and yet the Castro brothers are sitting there making demands on the United States government if we want to go back in there and normalize relations. The Cubans aren't doing anything. And so just a follow-up question, do you think the Obama administration's policy changes on Cuba will have any effect on the status of these 6,000 claims?
I am hopeful but guarded that they will be taken up between the two
Oh,
countries.
we're all hopeful.
It's up to the Congress to make them happen,
Amen to that.
because it is the Congress that would need to lift the remaining elements of the embargo that have not already been lifted. And if Congress refuses to lift the embargo until these claims are paid, then these claims will be paid if Cuba wants access to the U.S. market.
And honestly, I think the congressmen and women that I talk to believe we ought to keep the embargo in place until some of this is addressed, but I don't have a poll on that. Mr. Bradley, would you like to add anything to this discussion? If not, I'm going to move on to the ranking member.
I'd just say, speaking as a private citizen, I am aware that in past situations, such as I would point to Vietnam in particular, Vietnam still is a communist country, but it recognized and certainly Senator Helms played a big role in insisting that property claims were taken up early in the progress of arriving at normalization between Vietnam and the United States. And so that same analogy should apply here, in my view.
Right.
That same mindset should apply.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to turn to the ranking member. As you can see, I'm a little passionate about this issue because I believe that the Castro brothers are making immense demands on the United States for this normalization, and the administration is just giving in over and over and over without asking for concessions from the Cuban government if we're going to go forward with this. More concessions for the Cuban people, which I have a heart for. And you heard some of the things I talked about. But I think that, I go back to Tom Rooney's comments, some of the fundamental principles of a very free society, a free economy, is the right to own property. And understanding that I own this parcel and you own that parcel. And that I've got fee simple claims to this. And so I think this is an important aspect that I'm glad we're doing this hearing today, but because before we go forward anymore, this issue has to be addressed, and I'm glad we're addressing it today. I'll turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it wasn't just corporations and warehouses. You know, many Cuban nationals lost their properties. I can tell you, I came to this country, I was 11 years old. I still remember the military coming into the house, taking inventory of any items that we had in the house, because you could not remove any item from the house. If they came back after you got your visa and there were items missing, they would revoke your visa. I remember when they changed the currency. So if you had X amount of money in the bank, the government only said to you, you can only have this amount, and we're taking the rest of your money. I mean, I don't anticipate that my parents who built their own houses, they both passed away. And, you know, it may not be hope for anything, but I just hope for all those people who work their businesses, who, through their sweats, built something, a dream in their lives, could get some sort of compensation. And we cannot have a government in Cuba that stole that property and now use that property to continue their military machine on the island, because all those properties are owned by the military in Cuba, and they run the hotels, they run the businesses. So for me, this is a crusade, because I left when I was 11 years old, and I have this opportunity to serve in this great body in this great country, which gives me the opportunity to express how I feel about what the Castro brothers have done. They have stolen property from people who work all their lives. So with that, I'm just going to ask, during your time at the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, what were the challenges that you encountered? And,
Thank you, Congressman. For me, my challenges were to remain empathetic but impartial, because the claimants always had to prove their claim, and I too am from Cuba, and I experienced the same issue when I was a child. Well, my family did when I was a child, and the stories of the claimants were always quite emotional. And in my testimony, I described the feeling of losing your property and business in this traumatic way as, and I observe this in all the claimants that I speak with, that it must be what it feels like when you lose a child, because you never forget it. And people think it's just property, but to the people it happens to, it's not just property. It's their lives. They pour their lives into that house, that business, those shops, and when it happens to them, it's quite dramatic, and they never forget it. And that's why it's important that the Congress hold fast on the embargo and allow these claimants to find closure. So, but the Commission's work is very important. It's handled a lot of difficult issues. The claims process is transparent, so no one can challenge its validity or its approach to these claims, because, as I explain later in a testimony, these negotiated settlements are two voluntary bilateral agreements between two countries. And both countries need to have confidence in the other country's claims. And so our claims need to be on the record, transparent and clear as to the value and how we came to the value and who's the claimant and their nationality at the time. And that's all part of the claims process, and you have to be faithful to the claims process if you expect to have a successful negotiated settlement agreement.
Mr. Bradley, would you like to add anything to?
Mauricio was the chairman for 8 years. He covered it pretty well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Chair will now go to Mr. DeSantis from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to witnesses. You know, it's puzzling to me with dealing with the Cuba issue. We deal a lot with the Iran issue on this full committee, and it seems to be that the policies that the administration pursues are basically unilateral concessions to bad regimes, and really that serves as a detriment of the populations in those countries. I mean, in Iran, there was a green movement that was really threatening the viability of the regime. Administration chose to not embrace that because they wanted to try to have a better relationship with the Ayatollahs. And what we've seen since then is us engage in a lot of negotiations on the nuclear issue, where it's been concession after concession, and it doesn't seem like we've received much as a result. And I think the same thing with the Cuba issue. The policy is really a lifeline to the Castro regime and to the brothers and to the military. It's not doing anything to benefit the Cuban people. It's further solidifying the regime. And we're not getting, I mean, what have we received in the United States for these new policies? You know, we haven't received anything of note. They're still harboring terrorist fugitives in Cuba, people who are enemies of the country. And so it's really, really frustrating. And the property, to me, is just an easy issue, because if you're having a new relationship and you want to have, and the regime is going to move towards openness, well, obviously you give back the property. I mean, that, to me, that's just a bare minimum, and we haven't seen any property given back. So this whole policy, I think, is not going to be successful, just as the Iranian policy is not going to be successful. I know that we're going to be voting, and I know we have another panel, so I really appreciate your testimony, both of you. I'll go ahead and yield back the balance of my time so we can move forward.
I want to thank the gentleman, and I was just monitoring votes, which they say are going to call in a few minutes. So Mr. Donovan from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's the chairman's way of telling me be very brief. As my friend from Florida just said, there's people like Joanne Chesimar who have escaped the justice system of our United States after killing a New Jersey state trooper, and we're not demanding her return before we negotiate. And the poor people of Cuba, whose human rights are still being violated, we're not asking for anything in exchange. It seems like the regime is making all the demands on our country. So I just wanted to thank you first for coming here and addressing this important issue for the Cuban people, the residents there, and ask if you think there's anything else. I mean, you're well aware of what Congress is doing to try to rectify this wrong. Is there anything else that, in your opinion, should be done by this legislative body that will help this process along?
Thank you, Congressman. 3 things. Do not lift the remaining elements of the embargo that are in place. 2, create the housekeeping and updating of the current certified claims. And 3 things, create this penalty, a trespass penalty, so that these certified claimants no longer are held up by this gridlock over Cuba policy. Those 3 things should be done. I would also point to the Libyan settlement agreement as a possible model, because that was a very complex settlement agreement. It took a long time. The Congress was involved in that one. Unfortunately, I don't see the Congress involved in the current ongoing negotiations with Cuba, but at some point the Congress needs to become involved, because there are many more elements to this normalization process besides the certified claims. There's Joanne Chesimar matter and the other criminals. There's the judgments that exist in the U.S. If there ever is commerce between our countries, judgments could be attached to certain commerce that would be going on. So a lot of other issues have to be dealt with, and the Congress is going to have to be the one to deal with them.
Gentlemen, finished? Okay. I want to thank the gentleman. He's a brand new member of the subcommittee, and we want to welcome him, a new member of Congress as well. They have just called votes, so what we'd like to do is go into recess pending call of the chair, come back as soon as we can after the last vote, and what we'll do is we will adjourn this panel, and when we reconvene, we'll bring up the next panel. I want to thank the panelists for being here. Great testimony and great work, and I look forward to working with you. And with that, we'll stand in recess.
Testing, testing.
Go ahead and reconvene the hearing and welcome our second panel. Their biographies are in the information provided to the committee beforehand, so I will go ahead and recognize Dr. Garcia Bengochea.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Javier Garcia Bengochea. I'm a neurosurgeon in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm here not to discuss the litany of atrocities emblematic of Cuba under a Castro, but to testify about the importance of property. It is sufficient prologue to say that in Cuba, virtually everything is stolen. My family left Cuba when I was 15 months old after Fidel Castro confiscated 386 Cuban businesses on October 14, 1960. One of these, La Marítima Parreño, established in 1919, was a commercial shipping port and warehouses in Cuba's second largest city, Santiago, and a privately held Cuban corporation in which we had significant ownership. La Marítima and its president, my cousin Desi Parreño, had supported the revolution in its difficult early days. Fearing arrest if he challenged the dictatorship, Desi left Cuba the following day, having transformed from progressive to conservative overnight. A Princeton graduate and valedictorian of his 1938 class, Desi was no rube. He understood the impact of the confiscations on the rule of law and order. Like my parents, he feared civil war. 4 days later, President Eisenhower initiated sanctions that became the embargo. Eventually, Desi's brother, Alberto, an American citizen and New York lawyer, would receive certification from the U.S. Treasury for his loss. The world would isolate Cuba only to resume relations after settling their relatively small international claims. The claims of Americans and Cuban nationals, by far the largest groups, remain unsettled. These are the very reason for the embargo, yet incredibly until today, they have yet to be mentioned, despite that Cuba has confiscated billions in foreign assets and incarcerated dozens of foreign executives, some without charges since 2008 alone. Americans assume when they invest in Cuba, clear title and basic protections will be in place. Nothing could be further from the truth. Contract sanctity, an independent judiciary, and transparent regulatory and enforcement agencies do not exist there. Every American enterprise in Cuba, including tourism, will necessarily traffic in stolen properties, including brands and trademarks, maybe those of an American. That has certainly been my experience. The State Department, for example, has occupied a penthouse apartment since 1977 in a building I own without my permission, much less payment. At least two groups, Smith College and the Met, have received licenses to traffic in my port property. Countless licensed travelers have paid admission to Havana's Museum of Fine Arts to view paintings stolen off the walls of our home. Foreign entities, Fred Olson Cruise Lines and China Harbor Engineering Company, do business in the U.S. while using my stolen port. How is that right or even legal? The claims must be settled or there will be conflict. Although Cuba is bankrupt, there are ways this can be accomplished. They can simply return the property, despite the unsavory proposition of partnering with totalitarians. Cuba can pay with earnings from state-owned tourism, rum, art, and tobacco sales. Remittances to Cuba supporting ventures using stolen property could be taxed. Anti-trafficking laws should be robust and enforced, like Title IV in the visa application. Title III of Helms-Burton should no longer be waived. If a foreign terrorist who damages our property abroad can stand trial in a U.S. court, so can foreign traffickers. If Congress eliminates the embargo and leverage without a fair settlement, then the U.S. government should contribute. So-called business groups such as Engage Cuba and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who disgracefully lobby to lift sanctions without considering the claims, should pay, as well as companies who profited from sales allowed to Cuba since 2003. The claimants can receive tax credits and effectively pay themselves. A marketplace should be created to permit competitive bidding for the claims. When change, democracy comes, joint ventures and contracts between the regime and foreigners will be canceled. Confiscated properties will be returned to the rightful owners. Unfortunately, American enterprises that capitulate with Cuba's dictatorship will oppose change. We've linked their success to the survival of the Castro regime. I'll finish with an encounter in Cuba 2 years ago. Before the revolution, my father was Cuba's premier neurosurgeon and considered a pioneer of modern neurosurgical training there. I was invited to speak at a neurosurgery meeting in Havana, and after initially declining, I decided to attend. Ignacio, which is not his real name, owned a taxi service of vintage American cars. He was an IT specialist at a foreign firm in Cuba that closed after being robbed by the regime, who overlooked turning off his internet connection. He ordered parts online from the U.S., brought in by mules, and impeccably rebuilt his 1959 Bel Air. Upon congratulating him for his success, he expressed deep concern that as others made money and spent conspicuously, they, the government, would confiscate everything, quote, when it was no longer convenient for them. In a surreal yet transcendent moment, he admitted he'd become, quote, what you call in your country a conservative. Ladies and gentlemen, what is past is prologue. Unless the claims are settled, any American enterprise in Cuba will have the legitimacy of a drug deal. Trafficking in stolen property is not economic opportunity. It is not pro-business or normal. It is criminal and immoral. Property rights are the foundation of our economy and society. They promote competition through nonviolent and lawful means and define our human rights. Without them, there is no capitalism or economic development. A just claims settlement will protect future American businesses in Cuba and burgeoning Cuban entrepreneurs. The strength of our relationship with Cuba will directly correlate with the strength of the claims and settlements. Indeed, these claims are a litmus test of government and civil society itself. Validating the kleptocracy will undoubtedly bring more confiscations and the prospect of sanctioning Cuba, an embargo, again. To paraphrase the prophet Isaiah, peace is the work of justice, so too is normalization. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you for that testimony. I want to thank all the witnesses for sharing their stories with us today. I recognize Ms. Chesterland.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member
You
Sears.
can cut the microphone on, just push that little button.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Sears, and members of the committee for your leadership attention to this important matter to America and throughout the United States. We've been waiting a long time. My name is Carolyn Chester. I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm a single divorced mother of one teenage son, and I've been the sole supporter of my family since 2010. I have a modest house, I live a modest lifestyle, and I drive a 16-year-old car. I represent my family's claim number 1704. My father was Edmund Chester, and he was the director of CBS News, but most of you probably have never heard of him. My father supervised famed reporters such as Edward R. Murrell, Eric Sebright, and Howard K. Smith, all recognizable names, but not his. My father was a true patriot, combated communism as a soldier in World War I, an executive with CBS when he worked with our State Department's Office for Inter-American Affairs, Voice of America. When the communists took Cuba, they also took over the radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, and they were able to manipulate and rewrite history. That is when the lies and slanders of those that were in Cuba before 1959 started. My father's best friends were all patriots, and one of them was my godfather, General T. McInerney, who served as Lieutenant Colonel under General Eisenhower's staff and the Director of Public Relations for the U.S. Department of Justice. Excuse me, I'm a little nervous. I was just 6 months old when my family's properties were taken, so I refer to the letter that my father wrote to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, which explains the circumstances. Their property was actually taken in January 1959, before Castro created laws to make it legal to steal. They took an 80-acre farm from the Isle of Pines, Cuban telephone stock, our car, jewelry, furniture, and all our personal possessions that were in our apartment in Miramar. My parents spoke frequently about Cuba and what happened to them, and they thought justice would be served during their lifetime, but it was not. There was a time that our legislator and fellow Americans cared, but with time and memories passing, the confiscation has faded. It is almost as if the event has been erased from time and history. However, this still happened. It's very real, personal to us, and just because it happened a long time ago does not mean it didn't happen, because it did. I know from speaking to people about the U.S. certified claims that most don't understand anything about it, but it's very simple. We are Americans who were living, working, investing in Cuba when the communists took over and took our properties. We were not at war with Cuba, and this was the first time in U.S. history that American properties were expropriated during peacetime. Families lost their livelihood, suffered financial ruin for the loss of their possession. Castro didn't just confiscate our properties, but he also took the hopes, dreams that our parents once had for our future. Excuse me. The confiscation also affected my father's health. I was only 11 years old when his health began to decline. I remember that my father was in and out of hospital many times over the years, and my mother took care of him for many years, always hoping that he would improve, but he did not. Edmund Chester died in 1973 when I was 15 years old, and I never really knew what he died from, but looking back at it, I think it was from the Cuban loss and the stress. It caused him a series of strokes. He also suffered from bouts of confusion. I remember one incident when I was just a little girl. He was frightened because he thought the Castro's henchmen were in the house wanting to kill him, but nobody was there. So it was not until much later on in life that I understood why he was so scared. In 1959, a group of Castro's men shot at our home as they drove into our driveway. I remember hearing about this when I got older, and I also remember seeing the bullet holes in our wall of our family home in Mount Dora, Florida. So his paranoia was not unwarranted. After my father passed away, my mother was left alone to raise our children without any source of income. My mother did the best she could, and in the end, she sold everything, including personal items, to survive and support us. We never faulted her for selling our inheritance in order to make ends meet, and in the end, we were left with debt to pay back her creditors. We didn't abandon our properties, they were taken from us. And in many cases, claimants' properties were taken at gunpoint by Castro's soldiers. We didn't have any warning by our government that the new Cuban government was planning to steal our properties, yet apparently Castro's manifesto was written years ago and published in Mexico. He threatened that he would do this, and he did. And our government failed to protect us, and now some 55 years later, here we are defending our claims. We are Americans who were the victims and not the culprits. The notion that claimants should discount their claims in order to make way for commerce is unacceptable. We are not responsible for the economic failures of communism since we've already paid with our family fortunes. Furthermore, punitive damages for the pain and suffering that this has caused our families, along with 55 years of waiting, should have been included in this determination of the value of our claims. All foreign businesses have 50-50 partnerships with the Cuban government, so that means profits are being split. The United Kingdom and Canada, who are our allies, have enacted laws to protect their Cuban investments from our Helms-Burton Act. When a foreign company operating in Cuba pays their workers' salaries, it must all go to the Cuban government, who keeps 96% of it, leaving their worker with a pittance of their salary, and so they are treated as slaves. The Cuban government also collects lots of money from skimming off the remittance sent by Cuban Americans to their relatives in Cuba. The Cuban government does have a way to pay us back. They just don't want to because they're used to taking. I know that many will still think that the Cuban government is poor, and that's fine. But you must realize that once the floodgates of trade with the U.S. opens, there will be a means to pay us back, and we will accept payments as long as it's paid back in full. It is also very disturbing for me to hear that those working uncomfortably close with the Cuban government, Americans, tell us that we should only get pennies to our dollar. It is a well-known fact that the junta running Cuba has hired expert international accountants and lawyers to hide their fortune in offshore accounts that can never be traced. Our Office of Foreign Asset Control has collected billions and billions in fines from banks and businesses that broke our laws, so a portion of that money should have been used to pay back the American. Another solution would be to get another entity to pay our debt. There are a lot of U.S. conglomerates that are biting at the bit to do business with the Cubans, and if they want to get rid of us because they cause the obstacle, they should just buy our debt and deal with the Castros themselves, because we've been dealing with it for 55 years. There's also Cuban money that was frozen a long time ago that should have been part of the legislation, but that was admitted. And all we want is our payment for our claims set by the foreign claims settlement, and I think 55 years of a lifetime is waiting too long. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I'm finally feeling like someone gives a damn. God bless you.
Thank you, Ms. Chesterland. Ms. Rosoff is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm here on behalf of my family, especially my mother, who is 80 and could not be here today. I'm representing the 3 certified claims my family has filed with the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to share my family's story. My grandfather, Morris Schechter, later called Mauricio, moved to Cuba in 1902. He started a business and was a founding member of the United Hebrew Congregation in Havana. In 1913, he married my grandmother, Jeanette, and they became pillars of the Cuban-American Jewish community. Jeanette and Mauricio had 4 children, 2 of whom died in Cuba and are buried in the Guanabacoa Jewish cemetery that Mauricio helped to consecrate in 1910. My grandmother's house is the main part of CU 1458. My cousin, Robert Schechter, visited Cuba as part of a mission trip several years ago and was actually able to visit the house. At the time, and as far as I know to this day, it was being used by the Chinese embassy. Claim CU 1090, filed by my father, Roy, is based on the value of stocks and business holdings, including a shirt factory and wholesale business, a farm, and a portion of my grandmother's house. My father was born in June of 1924 and attended Ruston Academy, a bilingual school. He later attended the University of Michigan, but soon enlisted in the U.S. Army and fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He returned to Cuba after the war and worked in the family business, Compañía Onyx, which manufactured clothing. My father took over the business following the deaths of his father and older brother. In 1957, he married my mother, Lois Levine, and she joined him in Cuba. My maternal grandfather, Herbert Levine, also invested in Cuba and formed Rainbow Development Corporation, claim CU 611. This claim is comprised of a tract of land that had timber and very pure silica sand. They grew tobacco, tomatoes, and built a sawmill that provided jobs for local residents. The sawmill was sabotaged during the Revolution and set on fire. My mother said they think it was because they were Americans. The last time my parents went to the farm planning to do the payroll, they were met by armed soldiers, and after a brief discussion with them, my parents drove away, never to see the farm again. Immediately after the Revolution, business was actually good. In fact, my father invested money in updating machinery at the factory. After about 6 months, however, Castro imposed regulations that made it impossible for the factory to be productive. Essential commodities such as buttons and findings were impossible to find since they couldn't be imported. So they had no means to really make a living anymore. Leaving Cuba was a very difficult decision for them, but since they couldn't make a living, they really felt they had no choice. They paid off all of their debts so that when they could one day return to Cuba, they would be in good standing. They left on one of the last ferries to Key West in April of 1961, taking only clothes with them. My mother hid her wedding ring in a cloth diaper she stained with vanilla and smuggled it out in my brother's diaper bag. She figured that if the soldiers wanted to search a dirty diaper bag, they were welcome to her ring. They ended up in Nyack, New York, staying with my mother's parents. My father had great difficulty finding a job and eventually went to work in my grandfather's shoe store. I grew up knowing that my father hoped he would one day return to Cuba, but he passed away in 2004, and I know a part of him is still in Cuba. My grandmother, Jeanette, didn't plan on leaving Cuba, since her husband and 2 children were buried there in Guanabacoa. She left on what she thought was a vacation, but the political climate changed while she was in the States visiting family, and she couldn't return. My grandmother was in her 70s, frail, and had left her home with virtually nothing. She settled in Miami and lived with her sister-in-law, where they lived very frugally in a small apartment. She spent her last years in a nursing home and passed away at the age of 96, heartbroken that she never returned from her vacation. I would love to reclaim ownership of my grandmother's house. It's truly a family legacy and has great sentimental value to us. I don't know how realistic that is, but as far as the other 2 claims, I think that a fair, just financial settlement may be the best outcome. My father and grandmother had their homes, businesses, property, and investments stolen from them. There is no way to quantify it. Their lives were redefined without their consent, and multiple generations of our family have been affected. When my father filed the claims, it was in good faith that they would be honored and settled fairly. We look to you as our representatives to champion not just a new chapter in the political playbook, but to work side by side and as innovators in advocating justice. There is bound to be burgeoning opportunity in Cuba in the next few years, but it should not be at our expense. In this way, perhaps a plan can be crafted that ensures fair compensation to those of us who had property seized, while also allowing investment in a brighter future for the Cuban people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that testimony. Ms. Annalise Stengel is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much, Chairman Duncan, for allowing me to give this testimony this morning. And thank you to all those in attendance for your attention to this important issue. Before I begin my testimony, I would like to ask that a set of letters from Cuban pastors to you, Chairman Duncan, be entered into the record. Religious groups of all types, Catholic and Protestant, as well as other religious groups in Cuba, saw many of their properties confiscated in the years following the revolution. The return of some of these properties has been a key focus area of talks in recent years between the Roman Catholic Church and the Cuban government. Other religious groups have also held dialogues with the Cuban government with the same objective, with varying degrees of success. In recent years, the churches most vulnerable to the threat or act of government confiscation of their property have been what are usually referred to as house churches. Many are actual houses that have been converted by the owner at some point into a church. Others are buildings built more recently on private property and used exclusively as churches, but without permits for religious activity. Properties linked to unregistered religious groups are particularly vulnerable. One emblematic example has been that of the property located at Avellaneda 278 between San Esteban and San Martin Streets in the historic city center of Camagüey. This property was acquired by the Reverend Omar Gude Perez and his wife Kenya Dennis Bravo in 2003. A relatively large property for the location, it has acted as a family home and a place of worship. It is also a training center for church leaders from across the country who are affiliated with the Apostolic Movement, a charismatic Christian network of churches that authorities have refused to register. Before leaving the country in 2013, having received asylum in the United States, Reverend Gude and his wife officially transferred the property to their nephew, Reverend Jorvis Bravo. The transfer was carried out legally in line with Cuban laws. The transfer papers were in fact signed by a government notary. Reverend Bravo Dines was already living in the property with his wife and small child and subsequently took over the church and religious training center. In September 2013, the government summoned Reverend Bravo to a court hearing where they summarily found his ownership of the property to be invalid, despite the paperwork provided, and declared it to belong to the government. The government notary who had signed off on the transfer did not appear. Reverend Bravo refused to vacate the property and was subjected to a days-long act of repudiation. Shortly thereafter, Reverend Bravo was summoned by housing ministry officials who offered to allow him to stay in the property as a rent-paying tenant to the government if he agreed to submit all planned religious activities to the government in advance. The government set the rent for his own property at $300 per month, 15 times the annual salary for a Cuban. He turned down this offer, refused to sign the papers, and stated his intention to remain in the property. To date, he has managed to do so, although the government has repeatedly declared that it still considers itself to be the owner of the building and reserves the right to evict the family at any time. We believe they have not been evicted by force thus far because the case has received international attention. But the vulnerability of the family, who have been stripped of their property rights, remains of great concern. This year, on May 21st, the legal offices of Poblete y Tamargo submitted a request for precautionary measures on behalf of Reverend Bravo to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. Both Reverends Omar Gude and Jorvis Bravo have submitted letters, which I mentioned earlier. We regularly receive reports of threats of confiscation of properties from unregistered religious groups such as the Apostolic Movement, but the government is also guilty of targeting the property of historic and registered religious groups. The threat or act of confiscation of church properties has often appeared to be a tactic of the government to pressure or punish a church or larger denomination. One of the most egregious cases was the 2012 retroactive nationalization of a historic property belonging to the Baptist Church in Yaguajay in the province of Sancti Spiritus. The church is part of the Western Baptist Convention of Cuba, one of the largest historical and registered denominations in Cuba. More recently, CSW has received worrying news that new legislation, which came into effect of January of this year, is being used to justify the arbitrary expropriation of private property, including religious properties. On the surface, Legal Decree 322, the General Law on Housing, appears to be meant to regulate private properties, mostly homes, and enforce zoning laws, following other reforms that affect property rights. However, our contacts on the island say that the law is being used by government officials to claim the right to seize church properties and to force the churches into the role of paying tenant. You may recall this is identical to the offer made to Reverend Bravo Dines in 2013, prior to the adoption of the law, which suggests that it is a strategy that has been in development for some time. Cuban lawyers have told CSW that although the law does not specifically mention religious groups, government officials have claimed it gives them authority to expropriate property when they deem it necessary. To our knowledge, the largest church to be affected thus far by Legal Decree 322 is the Maranatha First Baptist Church in Holguin. This is another registered and historic religious property. Last month, the leadership of the church was informed by the Provincial Communist Party officials and housing ministry officials that their property was being confiscated and their status changed from owners to renters. The church has held title to the property since 1947, originally through the American Baptist Home Mission Society, and was officially registered as part of the Eastern Baptist Convention of Cuba in May 1954. Leaders of the church have published an open letter calling for support as they resist government attempts to seize their property. I am humbled to be here today, speaking on behalf of Cuban men and women who have for generations now maintained and cared for religious properties which have been and are sanctuaries for hundreds of thousands of Cubans in the face of great pressure and open hostility. While this is a historic problem and does not solely affect religious properties, it is also a current problem of ongoing violations. Much attention has been given to Raul Castro's announced property reforms, but less attention has been given to the detail of these reforms and their impact, potential and real, on ordinary Cubans. This subcommittee has a key role to play in putting a spotlight on those details and highlighting how even today, Cubans continue to be vulnerable to the arbitrary expropriation of their property by the government. Even as the administration continues to pursue a dialogue with the Cuban government, it is key that human rights, including property rights and religious freedom, be a central component of that dialogue. I would respectfully ask that the members of this subcommittee continue to hold the administration accountable for the content of the dialogue and any agreements, and at the same time, you make it clear to the Cuban government through statements or letters that these actions are not going unnoticed. Thank you.
I want to thank all the panelists. As you may have heard, there was a murder of 9 people in my state yesterday evening, and I'm going to have to step out of the hearing. I'm going to ask Mr. Yoho to accept running the rest of the hearing. I want to thank the panelists before I leave. Your testimony was valuable, and I've enjoyed learning about this issue, and I stand passionately with you for your property rights. And with that, I will turn this over to Mr. Yoho.
I appreciate you all being here and testifying, and I hear your stories, and it rips at the heartstrings. And, you know, being here on this panel of Foreign Affairs over the last 2 years, we've heard these stories about Cuba and what's going on, and I find it disheartening that this administration announced normalizing relationships with Cuba back in December 2014. The Obama administration announced a new Cuba policy to move towards normalization of relationships between the U.S. and Cuba and reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. We've got a law that already states how we go about that, and it was the Cuban Liberty and Solidarity Act of 1996. And it states in there that once Cuba moves towards normalizing their government in a transitional government and having a democratic process, we'll move into that direction. We haven't done that, and so, again, we see a situation where we're putting the cart before the horse. And once you get to that point, it's hard to go back. And in addition to that, when President Obama talked about normalizing this, it's a failed policy after 50 years is what he's felt like with our policies towards Cuba. And I look back at what Raul Castro said. He started making demands on us wanting to normalize relationships with Cuba. And I got to give him credit for having that kind of gravitas. I won't say another word, but, you know, for having that kind of a backbone to stand up and say, you know, not only, you're not going to normalize the relationships with us until you do this. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're the ones with the cookie. We're the ones that, had we followed through on the sanctions that were put in place and put more pressure on countries that were dealing with Cuba, it might have had a different outcome, and we might have a transitional government in place. And I look at, and I understand where you guys are coming from, and I stand 100% with you. You know, before we move forward, these things have to be negotiated, and they should be at the negotiating table before we start normalizing relationships with Cuba. And I would think that we would be the ones in the driver's seat. We're the ones that should be dictating that we'll normalize these relationships with Cuba if you compensate people for property that was stolen. Coming from Florida, I lived in South Florida growing up, and we've just had a tremendous amount of Cuban friends, hardworking people. I live up in north central Florida now. And, you know, the Cuban population is everywhere, great people, hardworking, and they love their country and, you know, their ancestry. And we want to make sure that as we move forward, that we take care of those things. And I think anything that this body does, speaking for myself, not for this committee, but anything that we do in government here should be to make sure that that wrong gets righted so that the people that had that property stolen gets put back into their hands. And thank you. I've got a few questions here. Adequate compensation for U.S. claims. What would a responsible and just outcome look like for the thousands of Americans who have had their property stolen, and we'll use the word stolen, by the Castro regime. Dr. Garcia?
That's a complicated question. Obviously, there are formulas. There's an international formula. I think we have to get our arms around what's the enormity of the problem. How many claims are still actively being pursued? There's several layers to this onion, of course. There's the strict economic damages. How much were the claims worth at the time? They're grossly undervalued at the time.
Right.
What's happened to them since then? Obviously, the economic damages to the claimants. Ironically, the best source for that probably is the very thieves themselves, the Cuban government. They claim that they're owed $1.1 trillion in damages from the embargo. That's damages to the claimants. That's to the property owners, the private industry.
And again, it goes back to the gravitas of the Castro regime saying, oh, we've been damaged in this, instead of looking the other way.
That is the most, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, that's the most disingenuous argument.
It really is, and I agree with you. Let me ask you one other question here. With the legislation, U.S. legislation on the property claims issue that's in the House and the Senate, are you guys familiar with that?
Yes.
It's H.R. 2466. That would require a plan for resolving U.S. property claims before the President could further ease restrictions on travel and trade. Do you guys have any view on that? Have you guys in your communities looked at that? Does anybody want to respond to that?
If I may.
Yes, sir.
Yes, in fact. This is not a left, right, Republican, Democrat issue. This is the blocking and tackling, the very foundation of economic relationships. And, there's one layer of this onion, as I said, are the certified claims, but there are hundreds of thousands of Cubans in exile who own property, and there are millions of Cubans in Cuba who own property or are disenfranchised. And I don't know how we can look into disenfranchising these people, putting them on the sidelines, and opening up so-called economic ties. This is crony capitalism, to create these rules that exclude some people but favor others. And this is truthfully what's been going on.
Well, and you brought up a great point. It comes down to the rule of law, and if you don't have a government that follows the rule of law, you get into these situations. And that's why it goes back to, before we move forward, we need to make sure they have a good transitional government that is going to respect property rights and follow that rule of law. I'm going to pass this on to the ranking member, Mr. Series.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to assure the panelists that we're not giving up on this. We are committed to continue to fight where it ends. Hopefully, will be a place we all can be, comfortable with. I really don't know how we negotiate. With the Cuban government. We seem to give in to everything and not get anything in return. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. Some people say the embargo is 50 years, yes, or 55 years, whatever. I understand that. But we do have embargoes in Iran. We have sanctions in Russia. And we're not going to remove anything from those countries until we get something back. I don't understand why the same premises cannot be towards Cuba. If we're going to lift some of these things that we currently have in Cuba, why not get something in return? And certainly property value is one of the issues that is most prominent. Like I stated before, my parents lost their house. I don't think we'll ever get it back. But there are people who lost a lot more than we did, and are going to certainly fight for those people that lost. Can you just tell me what has been the biggest challenge for you? Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Everyone talks about Cuba and who's behind this, and the president wants freedom. Honest to goodness, its U.S. businesses and their multinational subsidiaries that have spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands on attorneys to lobby to end the embargo. A lot of this is the people behind it is big business. And guess what? We're just an obstacle. Move us out of the way so they can make way for commerce. So that is the biggest obstacle, is that we are up against big money, and you know how that usually goes. So that's why I appreciate the fact that you all are actually here trying to find justice for us, because in all my research, and I've been doing this since 2008, it's just amazing how many people are actually U.S. businesses that are in Cuba investing right now, because American lawyers that are experts have shown them the loopholes. This is how you can invest in Cuba now. Why? Because when the economy opens up and trade opens up, you'll have a foothold. And if you know this, by now everyone does, that the Cuban communists, they control monopolies. So it's a perfect situation for a U.S. business to go in there and do business with the Cuban government, because therefore they're in a monopoly and they have no competition. There's a lot of big money that's behind this, and they'd like to see us go away. And that, to me, is the biggest obstacle.
May I add something?
I think we also face an obstacle in that the perception that in the American public is that the Cuban claims are ancient history and that nobody really pays attention to them anymore, but it's very real for us. You know, my mother is still alive. She, still shares stories about what happened to them. We grew up with this, and it is our current history. And I think people don't know what happened. There's perceptions that, Cuba was just an American playground and that people didn't have lives there. They didn't invest there. Not everybody that was in Cuba in the 1950s were gangsters and, gamblers. People built lives. These were real lives, of Americans, and they lost everything there. And their generations and descendants were all affected by this. And I think those perceptions have really been promoted recently, in a lot of stories and in the romantic notion of Cuba as this beach playground.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I think as far as the biggest obstacle we've faced in raising these issues is fear. We're working with Cubans still in Cuba who have managed in some way to retain what little they can. We're talking about church properties that are in disrepair because the government's refused to allow them to make any repairs on those buildings. Overcrowded, very kind of bad circumstances. A number of pastors we reached out to about this hearing and asked if they would be willing to come testify, and they were too afraid because they're afraid that what little they've managed to hold on to will be taken away from them. And their fear is justified. We've seen just this year, since the negotiations began, things have gotten worse. We've had many, many more properties suddenly being confiscated, many more threats of confiscation. And as long as that continues, I don't see how the Cuban government can be thought to be credible. Thank you.
Dr. Garcia.
Well, I was going to echo those sentiments and add that the notion of investing in a country with no property rights is absolutely ludicrous. And, aside from the fact that Cubans have no money, but there is a capricious nature to this. How these claims are settled is probably, in the grand scheme, when I'm dead and gone, more important to American businesses and entities that look to invest in Cuba, much less the burgeoning Cuban entrepreneur, this poor guy, the taxi driver. It's probably more important to them in the long run than it is to the existing claimants, how we handle this. This is an absolute fundamental issue. And again, I wouldn't paint it as partisan. It's not for or against the embargo. This is the rules of the road. We've got to understand them before we can move forward in this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good answers. They have called votes. We're going to go to Mr. DeSantis from Florida, but before we go there, what you just brought up is what this is all about, because if we set a bad precedence here, What happens in China with an American business that sits up there? You know, if China says, you know what, we're going to take them, or any other foreign country, or what happened in Crimea with Ukraine and Russia. You know, if we don't stand strong as the American government and we say we're not going to tolerate this, this sets that precedence for future generations, as you pointed out, and I appreciate that. We'll go to Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses. You know, Dr. Garcia, when you see a lot of the American businesses lobbying to do business in Cuba, knowing that, you know, they may be using the port that you have rights to or other confiscated property, I mean, you know, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's outrageous. It's not only hypocritical. Imagine if the roles were reversed. This is not who we are. If we are, as the president appears to have converted and become American exceptionalists, that we'll go over there and convert the Castros and convert the Cubans, well, this is not who we are. We're not people who traffic in stolen property. We're not opportunists at the very best. So it's disgraceful, truthfully. It really is. It violates every business, ethical, and moral principle that we have constructed our society from.
And it's not really a free market, you know, free market openings constrained by the rule of law. It's really just cronyism where you have a corrupt regime and there's a profit arrangement with a private entity, but ultimately that is, as you said, the whole basis of that is capricious.
It's Putinesque. It's what's happening in Russia. It's crony capitalism. At the very best, it is a sinister form of trickle-down economics. You are engaging a military oligarchy. We think of the Cuban government as this state. The government itself is an enormous bureaucracy that insulates these military oligarchical families from the Cuban people. They operate in an entirely different orbit, and that is who we're dealing with. That violates every principle we stand for.
If you left the hearing and as you were going, the president's motorcade popped out and you had a minute to talk to him, what would you say to the president about this issue?
I would tell him that first of all, history repeats itself. Human nature remains the same through time, and he's forgotten the history here. And if he's really concerned about growing prospects for American business and for helping the Cuban people, he has to get back to this fundamental social contract of property rights. It's one of the most innate human sentiments and experiences we have. Children fighting over a toy. Once you set the rules of the road, there's harmony. He needs to set back and use this as the foundation, as the cornerstone of building a new relationship with a free and democratic Cuba. Let's face it, there are no free markets without free people. It boils down to that. And so that's what I would tell him. Go back to the blocking and the tackling, the fundamentals, our DNA, and construct from there and get more peripheral and maybe esoteric in your objectives.
And that's what's concerning me about the policy is we're ignoring this basic building blocks of property rights. And yet, if you look at the political repression, that has increased since the change in policy. And so you're not laying the foundation where you have a rule of law and property rights, and you're certainly not in a situation where the Cuban people are now able to exercise political or religious freedom. I mean, it's not gone in the right direction. So I think it's been a lose-lose so far. Ms. Chester, I really appreciated your testimony. What would you say to the president about this issue if you could talk to him?
I would ask him why he responded to my email by calling me a Cuban exile. I am an American. I'm not Cuban. Then I would ask him why he's not paying attention to the law. The Foreign Claims Settlement Commission did due diligence for many, many years. My parents had to go through a lot of work to prove what their losses were. Why is that being ignored? Why have we been ignored for so long? I'm actually tired of this issue. I don't really want to sit here for months and months to figure this out. I want it to be figured out. I want us to be paid and somebody else figure it out, because right now there's 5,913 claimants that you're dealing with. So you don't really want to deal with 5,913 people, I don't think. So we need to be paid, and if somebody else can take that debt, since we've been holding it for 56 years, then they can deal with the Cuban government, because we're tired of waiting.
what's more important, the money or the admission of wrongdoing by the Cuban government?
You know, it's kind of hard to fight the Castro propaganda machine when you take over newspapers and televisions and radio stations. It's really hard to rewrite history or change people's mind.
Ms.
So-
Lamb, I'm going to have to cut you off
Yep.
there so we have
Out
time
of
for
time.
Ms. Kelly from the state of Illinois for a few minutes before votes.
I don't even really have a question, but just to say that I represent a family who's had a textile business, Flamingo Knitting Mills. It was seized in 1959 in Havana. So the issue of normalizing relations is quite personal to this family, as it is to so many families in America. And even, okay, if they get a lump sum payment, but even if they got the property back, the property is something else now. So what would they do with it? They can't kick, or they wouldn't kick people out, or, it still wouldn't be the same from before. So,
Exactly.
I yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys being here, speaking, and expressing your sentiments of what's going on there. I am a sponsor of H.R. 2466, which is the U.S. legislation on the property claims issue. So make sure you follow that, get people to support it. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing will remain open for 5 business days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. There being no further business, the subcommittee is adjourned, and we thank you for participating.
Thank you. Two four.